The sacred red cliffs of Canyon de Chelly rose like ancient sentinels against the morning sky, their weathered faces holding secrets older than memory. Sarah Crowfeather knelt on the narrow ledge where her grandmother had once taught her to pray, where Apache women had sought visions for countless generations. The wind carried the scent of sage and juniper as she scattered sacred pollen to the four directions, her voice lifted in the old language, asking the spirits for guidance in a world that seemed to offer her no clear path. At 21, Sarah existed between cultures like a shadow cast by two different suns. Her Apache blood sang in her veins when she walked these sacred canyons, when she heard the elders speak of the old ways, when she felt the spirit of her ancestors in every rock and tree. But her fair skin and green eyes, gifts from a Mexican father she had never known, marked her as different among her people. The soldiers at Fort Apache saw only another half-breed interpreter, useful for her languages but never fully trusted. The Apache saw a constant reminder of the world that pressed against their borders, threatening everything they held sacred. She finished her prayers and prepared to descend when movement caught her eye. Below, perhaps 50 yards away, a figure stumbled between the cottonwoods along the creek. Even from this distance, she could see the dark stain spreading across his shirt, the way he pressed one hand to his shoulder, while the other gripped the reins of a limping horse. The man was tall, powerfully built, with the easy movements of someone accustomed to violence and hardship. His clothes marked him as a cowboy or rancher, but something in the careful way he scanned his surroundings suggested more dangerous experience. Sarah's breath caught as the stranger looked up, his eyes finding her with startling accuracy. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other across the distance. His face was rugged and weathered with lines that spoke of years spent under the harsh desert sun, but his eyes held an intelligence and wariness that made her pulse quicken. This was not some drifting cowhand or local rancher. This was a man running from something, a man who had learned to trust no one and expect danger from every shadow. The smart thing would be to slip away unseen to pretend this encounter had never happened. Sarah knew the stories of what happened to Apache women who helped white men, knew the suspicion it would bring from her people and the assumptions it would create among the soldiers. But as she watched the stranger sway in his saddle, saw the way he fought to stay conscious, something deeper than wisdom stirred in her chest. Her grandmother's voice echoed in memory, words spoken in the old language during those long winter evenings when the snow trapped them in the hogan, and stories were the only warmth. The spirits place people in our path for reasons we may not understand. Sometimes helping a stranger is how we help ourselves. Sarah began picking her way down the cliff face with the sure-footed grace of someone who had been climbing these rocks since childhood. The stranger's horse had stopped at the water's edge, and the man was sliding sideways in his saddle, his grip on consciousness failing. She could hear his labored breathing as she approached, could smell the metallic scent of blood and the sweat of fear and pain. "Easy," she said softly in English, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as someone who had learned the language rather than being born to it. "I am not going to hurt you." The man's head jerked up, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip, before the pain in his shoulder made him gasp and abandon the motion. His eyes were gray, she realized, the color of storm clouds building over the mountains. They studied her with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope that made her chest tighten. "Apache." His voice was rough, strained with pain, but holding no fear. Most white men would have panicked at finding themselves wounded and helpless before an Apache woman. This one simply waited to see what she would do. "Half," Sarah replied, moving closer to his horse with slow, deliberate movements. "The other half is Mexican. Neither side claims me completely, so I get to choose my own path." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips, despite the pain etched in every line of his face. "That makes two of us, then. I am James Walker, and I seem to be having some trouble staying upright." "Sarah Crowfeather," she said, reaching up to steady him as he swayed again. "And you are bleeding all over sacred ground, which the spirits might not appreciate." The bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder, missing the bone, but leaving a wound that would need careful tending. She could see from the dried blood on his shirt that he had been riding for hours, possibly days. His horse was exhausted, foam dried white on its muzzle, and she suspected both man and animal were running on nothing but stubborn will. "Can you ride a little further?" she asked, studying his face for signs of how much strength he had left. "There is a place where I can tend that wound properly." James Walker met her eyes directly, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude, though, that was there. Not just relief at finding help in a hostile land. There was recognition, as if he saw something in her that others missed, as if he understood what it meant to exist caught between cultures. Why? And he asked simply, "You do not know me. For all you know, I am exactly the kind of man your people have good reason to fear." Sarah considered this feeling, the weight of the moment, settle around them like dust after a storm. She could still turn away, could leave him to his fate, and return to her life of careful balance between two worlds that neither fully accepted her. Instead, she found herself speaking words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought. "My grandmother always said that the spirits know what they are doing even when we do not. Perhaps they sent you here for a reason." The hidden canyon lay 3 miles deeper into the reservation, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through rock formations that seemed designed by nature to conceal and protect. Sarah's grandmother had shown her this place when she was 12, had told her the story of how Apache warriors had once hidden here from Mexican soldiers, how the caves had sheltered women and children during the worst of the Apache wars. Now the canyon held only memories and the sound of water trickling from springs that had run clear for centuries. James Walker had managed to stay in his saddle through sheer determination, though Sarah could see the cost in the gray pallor of his skin and the way his hands shook on the reins. She led his horse to the largest cave where ancient smoke stains on the ceiling spoke of countless fires, and the floor was still scattered with the remains of old camps. "This place is sacred to my people," she said as she helped him dismount, his weight briefly pressing against her as his legs buckled. "Warriors came here to dream of battles, women to dream of children. The spirits are strong here." She settled him on a blanket near the back of the cave where the rock wall would support him, then set about building a fire with practiced efficiency. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, revealing faded pictographs left by generations of Apache artists. Warriors on horseback buffalo hunts, symbols of protection and power that seemed to watch over them with ancient eyes. "I need to clean the wound," Sarah said, kneeling beside him with strips of clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey from his saddlebags. "This is going to hurt." James nodded, his jaw set in preparation for pain. As Sarah cut away his shirt, she tried to ignore the way the firelight played across the muscles of his chest and shoulders, tried not to notice the scars that spoke of a life lived dangerously. There was an old bullet scar near his ribs, knife marks on his forearms, the kind of damage that came from years of violence and survival. When she poured the whiskey over the wound, he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath, though she saw his hands clench into fists. His steel-colored gaze remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. "You have done this before," he observed, his voice tight but steady. "Living caught between cultures teaches you many skills," Sarah replied, beginning to stitch the wound with careful precision. "Apache women learn healing. Mexican women learn to tend gunshot wounds. I learned both." "And what did the white world teach you?" Sarah paused in her work, considering the question. "To be suspicious of everyone, to trust nothing I am told, and to always have a plan to run." James laughed, a sound rough with pain but genuine with understanding. "Good lessons. Ones I learned the hard way myself." As Sarah worked, she found herself studying his face in the firelight. There was something in his features that spoke of both hardness and kindness, of a man who had been forced to do terrible things but had not let them corrupt his essential nature. His eyes, when they were not clouded with pain, held an intelligence and depth that surprised her. "What are you running from?" she asked, tying off the last stitch. James was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and fresh guilt. "Justice depending on who you ask. I killed a man 3 days ago, shot him down in front of half the town of Tombstone." Sarah's hands stilled on the bandages, but she did not pull away. "Tell me why." "Thomas Morrison was his name, son of one of the biggest cattle barons in the territory, used to getting whatever he wanted and never hearing the word no. He decided he wanted a Mexican girl named Elena Vasquez, who worked in her family's store. When she refused him, he took what he wanted anyway. Then he killed her to keep her quiet." The words hung in the cave like smoke, carrying with them the weight of injustice and rage. Sarah had heard such stories before, had seen what men like Morrison did to women who could not fight back, who had no protectors, who existed outside the boundaries of law and society. "The sheriff would do nothing," James continued. "Morrison's father owned half the town, including the badge. So I tracked young Morrison down, called him out in the street, and put 3 bullets in him before he could clear leather. And now they hunt you. Every lawman in the territory plus Morrison's hired guns. They will not stop until I am dead or dancing at the end of a rope. Sarah finished bandaging his shoulder, her movements gentle but efficient. She understood now why he had looked at her without fear, why he had shown no surprise at finding help from an Apache woman. He was a man who had stepped outside the boundaries of law to seek justice just as she existed outside the boundaries of society by virtue of her mixed blood. "You did the right thing," she said simply. James met her eyes, and she saw something shift in them, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude. Most people would not see it that way. Most people have never watched helplessly while someone they cared about was destroyed by men who thought their power made them untouchable. There was something in her voice that made James study her more carefully. "You speak from experience." Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire, as memories she usually kept buried rose to the surface. "My mother was Apache, my father Mexican. She met him when she was working as an interpreter at the fort, fell in love with his stories of a different world where mixed blood children might find acceptance. He promised to take her to California to marry her properly, to give their child a name and a future." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave ceiling. Instead, he left when she told him she was with child. "Went back to Mexico, and his Mexican wife left my mother to face the shame alone. She died when I was 5, and I have spent every day since trying to find a place where I belong." James reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her hand where it rested on her knee. His fingers were warm and callous, gentle, despite their obvious strength. "I am sorry," he said, and the simple words carried more understanding than all the explanations and excuses she had heard from others. "The point is," Sarah continued, not pulling away from his touch, "I know what it is like to be caught between cultures, to be judged by people who do not understand the choices you have had to make. You killed a man who deserved killing. That does not make you a criminal in my eyes." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in thoughts of the paths that had brought them to this hidden canyon, this unlikely meeting. Outside, the desert night settled around them with its familiar sounds, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of wind through sage, the soft hoot of an owl hunting among the cottonwoods. James broke the silence first. "Why are you helping me?" Really, Sarah considered the question, searching for words to explain feelings she did not entirely understand herself. "Because you looked at me and saw a person, not just another half-breed interpreter. Because you answered my questions honestly even when the truth made you look like a killer. Because when I said this place was sacred, you did not laugh or make jokes about superstitious Indians." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "And because my grandmother always said that when the spirits put someone in your path, it is usually because they need saving and sometimes because they are meant to save you." James squeezed her hand gently. "What do you need saving from?" The question hung between them like a challenge demanding honesty. Sarah was not sure she was ready to give, but something in his eyes, some quality of attention and acceptance, made her want to try. "From spending my entire life straddling 2 lives," she said finally. "From always being too Apache for the white world and too white for the Apache world. From dying alone because I could never find anyone who understood what it meant to belong nowhere completely." James was quiet for a long moment, his cloud-colored eyes studying her face in the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "You are not alone anymore." The words should have meant nothing coming from a wounded stranger, a man she had known for mere hours. Instead, they hit Sarah like a physical blow, making her breath catch and her heart race. There was something in the way he said it, some quality of absolute certainty that made her believe him, despite every lesson experience had taught her about trusting too quickly. For 3 days, Sarah tended James's wounds and watched him grow stronger. She brought water from the spring, gathered plants for healing teas, shared jerky and parched corn from her supplies. They talked through the long desert days, sharing stories of their lives with an honesty that surprised them both. James told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about watching Apache raids that left families dead and buildings burning, about the hatred that had consumed him until he joined the Rangers and learned that the world was more complicated than his boyhood anger had allowed him to see. He spoke of campaigns against Apache bands of tracking raiders, across hundreds of miles of desert, of slowly learning to respect the enemy he fought. It took me years to understand, he said on the second evening, as they sat by their small fire, that every Apache warrior I hunted had probably watched his own family killed by men like me, that we were all caught in a cycle of violence that nobody knew how to break. Sarah shared her own stories, life in her grandmother's Ogun, learning the old ways and the new ones, simultaneously the confusion of being educated at the mission school while practicing Apache ceremonies in secret, the loneliness of serving as an interpreter at Fort Apache where neither side completely trusted her. The soldiers see me as Apache first, she explained. They assume I am always passing information to my people, always working against them. The Apache see me as corrupted by white education, too willing to work with the army, not truly one of them. And what do you see when you look in the mirror? Sarah considered the questions, staring into the flames that had become their evening companion. Someone trying to build a bridge between two worlds that might be too far apart to span. On the third night, James's fever finally broke completely, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Sarah woke to find him sitting up studying the pictographs on the cave wall with obvious fascination. The warriors, she said, moving to sit beside him, they would come here before battle to ask for visions, for guidance from the spirits. What kind of visions? Visions of victory, of safe return, of the enemy's weakness. Sometimes visions of their own death so they could prepare their spirits for the journey to the next world. James traced one of the painted figures with his finger, a warrior on horseback, with a lance raised toward the sky. Do you believe in visions? I believe the spirits speak to those who know how to listen. Whether we call it visions or instinct or luck, there are truths that come to us in ways we cannot explain. What truths have come to you here? Sarah felt her heart begin to race, felt the weight of words. She was not sure she was ready to speak. But something in the quiet intimacy of the firelit cave, something in the way James looked at her with those penetrating gray eyes made her brave. That some meetings are arranged by forces larger than chance, that some connections run deeper than the time it takes to form them, that sometimes saving a stranger is how we save ourselves. James turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes, the surprise of unexpected connection, the fear of hoping for something that seemed impossible, the recognition that this meeting had changed something fundamental in both their lives. Sarah, he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. She moved toward him without conscious thought, drawn by something stronger than wisdom or caution. When his hand cupped her face, she leaned into the touch like a flower turning towards sunlight. When his lips touched hers, soft and questioning, she answered with a certainty that surprised them both. The kiss deepened slowly, carefully, both of them aware of his healing wounds and the magnitude of what was happening between them. Sarah had been kissed before by Apache warriors seeking to court her and by soldiers at the fort who thought her mixed blood made her available for their amusement. But none of those clumsy advances had prepared her for this, for the way James kissed her, as if she were precious, as if her response mattered more than his own satisfaction. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. This is insane, he whispered. I am a wanted man with a price on my head, and you are. I'm a woman who has spent her entire life being told where I belong and who I can be. Do, Sarah interrupted. For once, I want to choose for myself. James pulled back to look at her, his eyes searching her face in the firelight. What are you choosing? Instead of answering with words, Sarah began unlacing her buckskin shirt with steady fingers, her eyes never leaving his. She saw desire flare in his gray eyes, but also concern, a question about whether she was certain about this step. I am 21 years old, she said quietly. I have spent every day of those years living by other people's rules, fitting myself into boxes others created for me. Tonight I want to be myself completely, without apology or explanation. James caught her hands, stilling their movement. Sarah, if we do this, there is no taking it back, and I cannot promise you a future. I might be dead in a week, or captured, or... Then we have tonight, Sarah said simply. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that is more than most people get. Something in her voice, some quality of absolute certainty, seemed to convince him. James released her hands and let her continue what she had started, his eyes drinking in the sight of her as she revealed herself to him with a boldness that came from decision rather than experience. In the firelight with the ancient spirits watching from the painted walls, They came together with a passion that seemed to burn away the barriers separating their worlds. James made love to her with a gentleness that honored both her inexperience and his own amazement at finding such connection with someone he had known for only days. Afterward, they lay entwined on the blankets, Sarah's head on James's good shoulder, listening to each other breathe, while the fire settled into glowing coals. The cave felt different now, charged with new intimacy, as if the ancient walls had witnessed the joining of not just two bodies, but two spirits. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, tracing lazy patterns on James's chest with her fingertip. James was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally answered, his voice held both determination and regret. "I have to leave. Every day I stay puts you in more danger. Morrison's men are probably already asking questions in the nearest towns, offering rewards for information. If they find out you helped me, they will not find out." "Sarah." James turned to face her, his expression serious. "These are not men who follow rules or worry about evidence. If they even suspect you know something, they will hurt you to make you talk. And your people, if they discover you have been harboring a white fugitive." Sarah knew he was right, had known from the moment she decided to help him that she was risking everything. Her position as interpreter, her fragile place in both communities, her safety, possibly her life. But lying here in his arms, feeling more complete than she had ever felt before, the price seemed almost bearable. "When will you go?" "Tomorrow night. I need another day for this shoulder to heal, and I need to plan a route that will keep the hunters away from this place." They held each other through the remaining hours of darkness, both aware that dawn would begin their countdown to separation. Sarah memorized the feel of James's body against hers, the sound of his breathing, the way his hand felt tangled in her hair. She tried to burn these sensations into memory, to create a store of warmth she could draw on during the cold nights that would follow his departure. When morning came, they moved around each other with careful politeness, both trying to pretend that what had happened between them was simply a moment of passion, rather than a fundamental change in who they were. But Sarah caught James watching her with an intensity that made her skin warm, and she found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking. The day passed too quickly, and not quickly enough. James tested his shoulder's range of motion, practiced drawing his gun with his left hand checked, and cleaned his weapons with the methodical care of someone whose life depended on such details. Sarah gathered additional supplies for his journey, tried to think of advice that might keep him alive in the brutal country he would have to cross. As evening approached, they could no longer pretend that everything was normal. The tension between them grew thick as summer storm clouds charged with words neither seemed able to speak. Finally, as Sarah prepared their simple meal of roasted rabbit and wild onions, James broke the silence that had stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. "I want you to know," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "that what happened last night, it was not just passion or loneliness or gratitude. It was—" "I know," Sarah said quietly, not turning from the fire. "It was the same for me." James moved behind her, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. "Then you understand why leaving is the hardest thing I have ever had to do." Sarah leaned back against his chest and allowing herself this moment of contact before he rode out of her life forever. "I understand why you have to go. That does not make it hurt less." They ate in silence as full darkness settled over the canyon. When the meal was finished, James began loading his saddlebags with methodical precision, while Sarah banked the fire that had been their companion for 3 nights. Every movement felt weighted with finality. James led his horse out of the cave and into the starlight, Sarah walking beside him to the place where the trail began, its winding ascent out of the canyon. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the thin desert air. "There is something I need to tell you," James said, turning to face her before mounting. "Something I should have said before last night, but I was too much of a coward." Sarah waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Never believed that kind of connection was possible. If circumstances were different, if I was not a wanted man, if you were not, if we were different people in a different world," Sarah finished softly. "Yes." James cupped her face in his hands, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "But we are who we are, and this is the world we live in." He kissed her, then often desperate, and final a kiss that tasted of goodbye and promises that could never be kept. When they broke apart, Sarah saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. "Will you be safe?" she asked. I will be careful. I will survive this, Sarah. I swear to you, I will find a way to survive this. James mounted his horse, the leather creaking softly in the stillness. For a moment he looked down at her, memorizing her face in the starlight, then turned his horse toward the trail. James, Sarah called softly, and he looked back. If you find a way to be free, if you ever find a place where James Walker can live without looking over his shoulder, remember that Sarah Crowfeather exists between cultures and might be willing to choose a new one. Something flared in his eyes, hope mixed with pain and determination. I will remember. And Sarah, if you ever need anything, if you are ever in danger, send word to the Bar W Ranch outside of Tucson. My friend Tom Bradley owns it now, but he will know how to reach me. And then he was riding up the narrow trail, his horse picking its way carefully between the rocks. Sarah watched until the darkness swallowed them completely, until even the sound of hoofbeats faded into the whisper of wind through stone. She stood alone in the canyon for a long time, surrounded by the ancient silence and the weight of what had just walked out of her life. Finally, she returned to the cave to gather her own belongings and erase the signs of their presence. By morning, it would look as if no one had been there at all. But as Sarah prepared to return to her other life, to slip back into her role as interpreter and bridge between worlds, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been fundamentally changed. She had tasted what it meant to be seen completely, to be wanted. Not despite her mixed blood and uncertain place in the world, but because of the unique perspective those things gave her. James Walker might be riding toward an uncertain fate, but he had given her something precious, the knowledge that connection was possible, that somewhere in the world there might be a place where she could belong completely to someone who belonged completely to her. The thought would sustain her through the difficult days ahead, when questions would be asked and suspicions raised, when she would have to pretend that her 3-day absence had been nothing more than a vision quest in the old tradition. She would return to Fort Apache, and her work as interpreter would resume her careful balance between worlds. But part of her would always remain in this hidden canyon, in the firelight, in the painted walls, in the memory of storm-gray eyes that had seen her truly for the first time in her life. 6 weeks had passed since James Walker rode out of the hidden canyon, and it was then that Sarah discovered the life growing within her, the consequence of their single night of passion that would change everything. The realization came not as shock, but as a deep primal certainty that seemed to rise from the earth itself. She stood at the edge of the same cliff where she had first seen James, one hand pressed to her still flat belly, and felt the weight of impossible choices settling around her shoulders like a winter storm. Sarah had returned to Fort Apache and slipped back into her role as interpreter with practiced ease, her face showing nothing of the transformation that had occurred in those firelit caves. The soldiers noticed no difference in the woman who translated their words into Apache, who helped negotiate the endless stream of disputes and misunderstandings that arose between two peoples who shared the same land but lived in different worlds. But the nausea that plagued her mornings and the subtle changes in her body could not be hidden much longer. In Apache society, an unmarried woman bearing a child faced disgrace and exile. In the white world, she would be considered ruined, useful only for the most menial work. And a child of mixed blood, fathered by a wanted criminal, would belong nowhere at all. The first sign that her carefully maintained balance was about to shatter came on a morning when the desert heat already shimmered off the parade ground before the sun had fully risen. Sarah was translating for a meeting between Colonel Henderson and Chief Running Bear, her grandfather discussing the boundaries of the reservation and the constant problem of Apache hunters crossing into territory claimed by white ranchers. The conversation was routine, the kind of careful negotiation that had become Sarah's specialty. She spoke the white man's demands in Apache, softening the harsh edges while preserving the essential meaning. She translated her grandfather's responses into English, finding diplomatic ways to express Apache frustration without triggering the colonel's famous temper. It was delicate work that required absolute concentration, which was why it took her several moments to realize that someone was watching her with unusual intensity. She glanced up from her notebook to find a tall man in expensive clothes standing at the edge of the group, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an attention that made her skin crawl. He was perhaps 55 years old, with silver hair and the kind of soft hands that spoke of a life spent giving orders rather than following them. His clothes marked him as wealthy, probably a cattle baron or mining investor, the kind of man who came to Fort Apache to discuss business deals that would reshape the territory according to his vision. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch in recognition and fear. She had seen those eyes before in the face of a younger man who had died in the street of Tombstone with 3 bullets in his chest. This was Morrison Sr., Thomas Morrison's father, the cattle baron, whose son James had killed in the name of justice. Morrison waited until the meeting concluded and Chief Running Bear had departed with his usual dignified silence before approaching Sarah. She forced herself to remain calm, to show nothing of the panic that was racing through her veins like wildfire. "Miss Crowfeather, is it not?" Morrison's voice was cultured, friendly, the tone of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm before resorting to more direct methods. "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." Sarah glanced toward Colonel Henderson, but the officer was already walking away, clearly having no interest in whatever business Morrison had with the fort's interpreter. She was alone with the most dangerous man in the territory, and no one seemed to notice or care. "Of course, Mr. Morrison," Sarah replied, proud that her voice showed none of the fear that was threatening to choke her. "How can I help you?" Morrison smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "I am looking for information about a man named James Walker. I have reason to believe he may have been seen in this area recently." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she had spent years learning to control her reactions in front of men who would use any sign of weakness against her. She arranged her features into a politely puzzled expression. "James Walker, I am afraid the name is not familiar to me. Perhaps if you could describe him. Tall man, dark hair, steel-colored eyes, moves like someone with military training. He would have been wounded probably in the shoulder or arm. The kind of man who might seek help from sympathetic locals." The emphasis he placed on the last words made it clear that he knew exactly what he was implying. Sarah felt trapped between the urge to run and the knowledge that running would only confirm his suspicions. "I am sorry, but I have not seen anyone matching that description. The Apache are not usually inclined to help wounded white men, as you might imagine." Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the expensive cologne he wore and see the cold calculation in his pale eyes. "Miss Crowfeather, I think you may be underestimating both my intelligence and my determination. James Walker killed my son. I intend to see him hang for that crime, and I am prepared to be very generous to anyone who helps me achieve that goal." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. $500 for information leading to Walker's capture. 1,000 if that information comes from someone who has actually seen him recently. Sarah stared at the pouch, calculating rapidly. $1,000 was more money than she would make in 5 years as an interpreter. It was enough to leave Fort Apache, to travel to California or Colorado, to start a completely new life away from the constant tension of existing between hostile worlds. All she had to do was betray the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and desired. "That is very generous," she said carefully. "But as I said, I have not seen this man." Morrison's smile grew wider and somehow more threatening. "Of course not. But if you should happen to encounter him or hear any rumors about him, I trust you will remember my offer." He tucked the pouch back into his jacket, but not before making sure Sarah got a good look at its size and weight. "I should mention that I am not the only one looking for James Walker. The territorial marshal has put together a special posse, and there are bounty hunters throughout Arizona and New Mexico who would very much like to collect the price on his head." Morrison paused, letting the implications of his words sink in. It would be unfortunate if Walker were to find shelter with someone who thought they were being kind, only to discover that their kindness had made them an accessory to murder. The law takes a very dim view of those who aid fugitives, especially when the fugitive has killed the son of a prominent citizen. The threat was clear enough that even Sarah's diplomatic training could not soften it. Morrison was telling her that if she had helped James, he would make sure she paid the price along with him. The fact that he was making this threat suggested he already suspected her involvement, was simply giving her a chance to cooperate before he resorted to more direct methods of extracting information. "I understand completely," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear that was making her hands shake. "Justice must be served." "Exactly." Morrison tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "I am staying at the Butterfield Hotel in Tucson for the next week should you remember anything that might be helpful. After that, I will be returning to my ranch, but Colonel Henderson knows how to reach me." He walked away with the confident stride of a man who believed he had made his point, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dusty parade ground with the terrible knowledge that her world was about to collapse around her. Morrison might not have proof that she had helped James, but he clearly suspected it. And if he was determined enough to track down every lead, no matter how slight, he would eventually find someone who had seen her during those 3 missing days. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine duties and mounting panic. Sarah translated documents, mediated disputes, attended meetings, all while her mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. She could run, could disappear into the vast expanse of Apache territory, and hope that Morrison would eventually give up his pursuit. But running would abandon her grandfather, and the few people who had given her a place in the world would confirm Morrison's suspicions and probably bring his vengeance down on her entire band. She could stay and brazen it out, could continue to deny any knowledge of James Walker, and hope that Morrison's investigation would lead him away from the hidden canyon. But she knew how determined men like Morrison could be when their pride was wounded, knew that he would not rest until he had found someone to blame for his son's death. Or she could tell Morrison what he wanted to know, could trade James's life for her own safety and the safety of her people. The thought made her physically sick, but she forced herself to consider it. James was probably hundreds of miles away by now, might already be safe in Mexico or California. Even if Morrison captured him, there was a chance that a jury would see the justice in what James had done, might refuse to convict a man who had killed to avenge a helpless woman. But even as Sarah tried to convince herself that betraying James might be the rational choice, she knew she could never do it. Not just because of the night they had shared, though those memories burned in her heart like sacred fire, but because James had shown her what it meant to choose justice over safety, to risk everything for what was right rather than what was expedient. 3 days later, the news that would shatter any hope of peace came through official channels. Morrison had not been content to wait for information about James Walker. Reports reached in Fort Apache of a brutal attack on an Apache camp 20 miles south of the reservation. 3 families slaughtered with a savagery that shocked even hardened soldiers. Women and children had been killed, their bodies mutilated and left for scavengers. The attackers had taken scalps in the old Apache way, but survivors spoke of white men painted to look like Indians, led by a man with silver hair who spoke fluent Spanish. Chief Running Bear arrived at Fort Apache with a delegation of warriors, their faces painted for war and their eyes burning with the kind of rage that had historically led to years of bloodshed. Sarah was summoned to translate as her grandfather confronted Colonel Henderson about the massacre. The attack was led by Morrison, Running Bear said without preamble, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man pushed beyond his limits. He tortured our people for information about the white man who killed his son, then slaughtered them when they had nothing to tell him. Colonel Henderson's face went pale as the implications sank in. Chief Running Bear, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof that Morrison was involved? We have the word of survivors who recognized him, Running Bear replied grimly. We have the testimony of children who watched their parents die while that silver-haired devil questioned them about a wounded white man they had never seen. Sarah felt the world spinning around her as she translated her grandfather's words. Morrison had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed atrocities that would demand blood vengeance from the Apache. The careful peace that had existed between Fort Apache and the surrounding bands was about to explode into warfare, and it was all because of the night she had spent in James Walker's arms. Miss Crowfeather, Henderson said carefully, I need you to ask Chief Running Bear what he intends to do about this situation. Sarah looked into her grandfather's eyes and saw there the same terrible resolve that had once carried Apache warriors into battle against impossible odds. She already knew his answer, but protocol demanded that she ask. My grandfather wants to know what the Army intends to do, she said instead. Will Morrison face justice for the murder of Apache families? Henderson was quiet for a long moment, staring out his window at the parade ground where soldiers went through their daily drills. When he finally spoke, his voice held the weariness of a career officer who had seen too many situations where the right answer was also the impossible one. Miss Crowfeather, you know as well as I do that Morrison's political connections make him essentially untouchable through legal channels. Even if we could prove his involvement, which would be difficult, the territorial courts would find ways to excuse his actions as legitimate pursuit of a dangerous criminal. Running Bear spoke a single word in Apache, a curse that needed no translation. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes as she realized that her people would pay the price for her choices, that her moment of passion with James Walker had set in motion events that would lead to suffering and death for innocents who had never even known his name. Tell your grandfather, Henderson continued, that I cannot officially condone any action he might take, but also tell him that I cannot prevent Apache warriors from defending their families against murderers, even if those murderers happen to be wealthy white men with political influence. Sarah translated the colonel's words, watching her grandfather's face as he absorbed the unofficial permission he had been seeking. Henderson was a decent man trapped by the constraints of his position, but he was also a soldier who understood that some injustices could only be answered with violence. That evening, Sarah walked out to the place where her grandmother's spirit house stood among the cottonwoods, seeking the kind of guidance that could only come from the old woman who had raised her. The tiny structure was built in the traditional way designed to shelter the spirit of the dead while they made their journey to the next world. Sarah's grandmother had been dead for 2 years, but her presence still seemed to linger in this place where she had come to pray and seek visions. Sarah knelt before the spirit house and spoke in the old language, asking for wisdom and strength for the trials that lay ahead. As she prayed, she became aware of another presence, someone moving through the cottonwoods, with the kind of careful stealth that meant either hunter or hunted. Her hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt as she rose and turned toward the sound. A figure stepped out of the shadows between the trees, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the tall form and gray eyes of James Walker. He looked different than he had 6 weeks ago. Thinner, harder, with new lines of strain around his eyes and fresh scars on his hands. His clothes were dusty and worn, his beard longer, his hair bleached nearly white by the desert sun. But his eyes were the same, and they lit up with joy and relief when they found her face. Sarah, he said, her name a prayer on his lips. She ran to him without thinking, forgetting caution and common sense in the overwhelming joy of seeing him alive. He caught her in his arms and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, the world consisted of nothing but the feel of his hands on her waist, the sound of his laughter mixing with her own, the impossible reality of his presence. Then sanity reasserted itself, and Sarah pushed back from his embrace with panic rising in her throat. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Morrison is at Fort Apache. He was asking about you offering rewards for information. If anyone sees you here—" Morrison, James's expression went hard and dangerous. "What did he want?" "He knows you were in this area. I do not know how, but he suspects someone helped you. James, you have to leave immediately. If he finds you here, if he connects you to me—" Sarah's voice broke as she remembered the slaughtered families, the children who had watched their parents die because of Morrison's obsession with revenge. James cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle, despite the tension radiating through his body. "Sarah, there is something I need to tell you. Something that changes everything." "Nothing has changed," Sarah said desperately. "You are still wanted for murder. I am still trapped between cultures, and now Morrison suspects I helped you. The only thing that has changed is that now we are both in danger." "That is not what I came to tell you." James's voice was soft but urgent. "Sarah, I think I am in love with you." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. She had dreamed of hearing those words, had imagined them whispered in the darkness of lonely nights. But hearing them now, with Morrison's threats still echoing in her ears and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders, they felt more like a curse than a blessing. "James, you cannot. We cannot." She pulled away from his touch, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold her breaking heart together through physical pressure. "Do you know what you are asking of me?" "I am not asking anything," James said quietly. "I am telling you how I feel, and I am offering you a choice. Come with me, Sarah. Tonight. We can be in Mexico by morning in California in a month. I have money saved enough to buy land and start fresh with new names. And live as fugitives for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulders, never able to trust anyone, never able to build anything permanent. It would not be forever. Eventually Morrison will give up or die or find some other cause to pursue. And even if he does not, would it be so terrible to spend your life with someone who loves you completely?" The temptation in his words was almost unbearable. Sarah could picture it riding away from Fort Apache and all its complications starting fresh in some distant place where James Walker and Sarah Crowfeather could become different people with different histories. It would be dangerous, uncertain, possibly short-lived, but it would be theirs. "What about my grandfather?" she asked. "What about my people? If I disappear, Morrison will take his suspicions out on them. The Apache are always the first to be blamed when something goes wrong." James was quiet for a moment, understanding the impossible position she was in. What if there was another way? What if I could remove Morrison as a threat permanently? "You mean kill him?" Sarah's voice was sharp with alarm. "James, that would only make things worse. His death would bring more attention, more investigators, more danger for everyone." "Not necessarily. Morrison has plenty of enemies, people who have been hurt by his business practices or his family's arrogance. If he were to meet with an unfortunate accident—" "No," Sarah's voice was firm, final. "I will not be responsible for another death, no matter how much he might deserve it. There has to be another way." James pulled her close again, and this time she did not resist. She buried her face against his chest and breathed in the familiar scent of leather and sage that she had missed more than she cared to admit. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, his chin resting on top of her head. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think clearly, despite the storm of emotions raging through her. But before she could answer, another voice cut through the darkness, speaking in Apache with the authority of absolute command. "Granddaughter, step away from the white man. We need to speak." Sarah spun around to find Chief Running Bear emerging from the shadows, accompanied by 3 Apache warriors whose faces were painted for war. Her grandfather's expression was unreadable, but Sarah could see the tension in his stance, the way his hand rested near his knife. James immediately moved to place himself between Sarah and the Apache warriors, his own hand dropping to his gun. "Grandfather," Sarah said quickly in Apache, "this is not what it appears to be." "Is it not?" Running Bear replied in the same language. "My granddaughter embracing the man whose actions have brought Morrison's vengeance down upon our people, the man whose very presence here puts all our lives at risk." Sarah felt the weight of her grandfather's disappointment like a physical blow. She had expected anger, had prepared herself for condemnation, but the quiet sadness in Running Bear's voice was somehow worse than rage would have been. "Tell me, granddaughter," Running Bear continued, "how long have you been hiding this man's presence from your people? How long have you been choosing the safety of our enemy over the lives of Apache children?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah understood now that her grandfather had been watching, had known about her meetings with James, had perhaps even witnessed their passionate encounter weeks earlier. She had thought herself clever in keeping their connection secret, but Running Bear had earned his position as chief through wisdom and observation that few could match. "I was not hiding him," Sarah said, finally switching to English so that James could understand. "He is not our enemy. He killed Morrison's son to avenge the rape and murder of an innocent girl. He chose justice over law, just as Apache warriors have always done when the white man's courts failed to protect the helpless." Running Bear studied James with the intensity of a hunter evaluating potential prey. "You are James Walker," he said in accented English, "the man who brought Morrison's hatred down upon the Apache." "I am," James replied, meeting the chief's gaze without flinching, "and I take full responsibility for the consequences of my actions. If you want me to leave to draw Morrison away from your people, I will go." "Leaving will not solve the problem," Running Bear said grimly. "Morrison has already shown his true nature. He will use any excuse to justify his attacks on Apache families, will turn your escape into proof that we are harboring criminals and must be punished." The old chief stepped closer, his weathered face showing the accumulated wisdom of decades spent protecting his people from enemies who possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers and weapons. "There is only one way to end Morrison's threat permanently. He must die, and his death must be seen as the natural consequence of his own actions rather than Apache vengeance." James straightened, understanding immediately what Running Bear was suggesting. "You want me to kill him?" "I want Morrison to die in a way that cannot be traced back to the Apache," Running Bear corrected. "Whether you are the instrument of that death, or whether it comes through other means matters less than the result." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what her grandfather was proposing. This was not just about ending Morrison's threat to James or even about protecting Apache families from further attacks. This was about eliminating a man whose very existence had become incompatible with Apache survival in a changing world. "And if I refuse," James asked, "if I choose to run rather than risk more bloodshed, then you run alone," Running Bear replied bluntly. "My granddaughter has responsibilities to her people that transcend her feelings for you. She will not be permitted to abandon those responsibilities for a man who lacks the courage to fight for what he claims to value." The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face. Her grandfather was offering James a test, a chance to prove himself worthy of Apache alliance through action rather than words. But he was also making it clear that Sarah's future depended on James's choice, that her place in Apache society was contingent on his willingness to stand and fight rather than run. "Grandfather," Sarah began, but Running Bear cut her off with a gesture. "This is not your choice to make, granddaughter. You have already chosen in your heart, if not in your words. Now the white man must choose whether he is worthy of what you offer." James was quiet for a long moment, his steel-colored eyes studying the faces of the Apache warriors who surrounded them. Sarah could see him calculating odds, considering options, weighing the cost of violence against the price of cowardice. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "Morrison has gathered nearly 30 hired guns," Running Bear replied. "They are camped at Devil's Spring 20 miles from here, preparing for a sweep through Apache territory. He believes that overwhelming force and the threat of collective punishment will eventually break our resistance and force someone to reveal your location." The chief gestured toward his warriors' men, whose faces showed the grim determination of hunters who had chosen their prey. "We propose to give Morrison exactly what he is looking for, but not in the way he expects. You will allow yourself to be seen, will lead his force into terrain where Apache tactics can neutralize their advantages in numbers and firepower." Sarah felt her blood turn cold as she realized what Running Bear was suggesting. "You want James to serve as bait for Morrison's entire force? That is suicide." "It is war," Running Bear corrected. "The kind of war Apache warriors have been fighting for generations against enemies who possessed every advantage except knowledge of the land and the will to sacrifice everything for victory." James nodded slowly, understanding both the tactical brilliance and the enormous risk of what was being proposed. "Where would this battle take place?" "Devil's Gateway," Running Bear replied. "A box canyon where the terrain forces attackers into a narrow passage between towering walls. Once inside, retreat becomes impossible and superior firepower means nothing when the enemy can attack from above with arrows and drop stones." Sarah had heard stories of Devil's Gateway, knew it as the place where Apache warriors had once trapped an entire company of Mexican soldiers and killed them to the last man. It was a perfect killing ground for those who knew its secrets, but reaching it would require James to expose himself to Morrison's guns for miles of open desert. "How many warriors would you commit to this battle?" James asked. 20, Running Bear replied. "Enough to control the high ground and block the canyon mouth, but not so many that their loss would cripple our ability to defend other camps." Sarah realized with growing horror that her grandfather was planning what amounted to a suicide mission, a desperate gamble that might eliminate Morrison's threat, but would almost certainly cost the lives of most of the participants. Apache warfare had always involved such calculations, trading certain death for the possibility of protecting the larger community. "I will not ask Apache warriors to die for my mistakes," James said firmly. "If Morrison wants me, let him come alone. I will face him man to man and settle this without involving innocent people." "Morrison will never agree to single combat," Running Bear replied with something that might have been approval for James's sentiment. "He is a coward who hides behind hired guns and political influence. The only way to draw him into our trap is to make him believe he has you cornered with no possibility of escape." Sarah found her voice at last, understanding that she was about to lose either the man she loved or the grandfather who had raised her, possibly both. There has to be another way. What if we could turn Morrison's men against him? What if we could offer them something more valuable than his gold? Both men looked at her with expressions of polite skepticism, but Sarah pressed on the germ of an idea beginning to form in her mind. Morrison's hired guns are professionals, men who fight for money rather than loyalty. If they believed Morrison was leading them into a trap, if they thought he was willing to sacrifice them to achieve his personal vengeance, some of them might reconsider their employment. Running Bear shook his head dismissively. White mercenaries are not Apache warriors. They do not value honor above profit, do not understand the meaning of loyalty to something larger than themselves. But they do understand survival, Sarah insisted. And they understand that dead men cannot spend gold. If we could convince them that following Morrison means death, while letting him go means they live to fight another day. James caught on to her reasoning first. You want to offer them safe passage in exchange for abandoning Morrison. More than that, Sarah replied, her mind racing through possibilities. I want to give them information that makes continuing this hunt seem like madness. Tell them about Apache alliances they do not know about terrain that favors defenders, about the price the army will exact if this escalates into full warfare. Running Bear considered her words with the careful attention he gave to all tactical suggestions, regardless of their source. It is possible that some of Morrison's men might be persuaded to leave if they understood the true danger of their situation. But Morrison himself will never retreat. His pride and his hatred run too deep. Then we separate him from his support, James said, beginning to see the outlines of Sarah's plan. Convince his men to abandon him, then face him with a force small enough that Apache warriors can handle without sustaining heavy casualties. The idea had merit, but Sarah could see flaws in the execution that might doom them all. Morrison's hired guns were experienced fighters who would not be easily fooled by Apache propaganda. They would demand proof of the dangers Sarah described, would want to see evidence that continuing their hunt would lead to disaster. We would need someone Morrison trusts to carry our message, Sarah said slowly. Someone his men would believe, whose word carries weight among professional fighters. Joseph Crow Dog, Running Bear said with disgust. The Apache traitor who guides Morrison's forces and translates our words for his benefit. Morrison trusts him because he has proven his hatred of his own people through repeated betrayals. Sarah felt sick at the mention of Crow Dog's name. She had known him as a child, had played with him during tribal gatherings before he chose the path of collaboration with Apache enemies. His transformation from promising young warrior to despised outcast was a source of shame for the entire band. Could we reach him? Could we convince him to carry false information back to Morrison? Crow Dog is beyond redemption, Running Bear replied flatly. He has chosen his path and must live with the consequences. But there might be others among Morrison's men who could be turned fighters who joined his cause for money rather than conviction. The war council that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The Apache approach to strategy was both more fluid and more ruthless than the military planning she was accustomed to, based on intimate knowledge of the terrain and an understanding of psychology that came from generations of asymmetrical warfare. But as they planned through the night, developing tactics and contingencies for a battle that might determine the fate of their entire people, Sarah found herself thinking not about victory or defeat, but about the child growing in her womb. Win or lose, the coming fight would change everything, would reshape the relationships between Apache bands and the territorial government in ways that could not be predicted. She had not yet told James about the pregnancy, had not found words to explain how their single night of passion had created a life that would need protection in a world that showed little mercy to children of mixed blood. But as she watched him planning alongside Apache warriors who had accepted him as a brother in arms, she realized that the child might be the bridge between worlds she had always sought to become. The next morning brought news that accelerated their timeline dramatically. Morrison's scouts had been seen within 5 miles of Fort Apache, close enough to begin questioning individual Apache families about suspicious activities or missing persons. The net was closing, and they had perhaps 48 hours before Morrison's investigation led him directly to Sarah and her connection to James Walker. We move tonight, Running Bear announced, as his warriors checked weapons and prepared for what might be their final battle. Morrison will expect an attack at dawn, will position his men to defend against traditional Apache tactics. We strike in darkness when his hired guns are thinking about sleep rather than battle. James nodded agreement, understanding the psychology of professional fighters well enough to know that night attacks created confusion and panic that could be more devastating than superior firepower. What about the plan to turn his men against him? Do we still attempt to split his force? Grey Wolf will carry false information to Morrison's camp, Running Bear replied, indicating his son with a gesture of pride mixed with fear. He will claim to be a warrior seeking revenge against the Apache who killed his family, will offer to guide Morrison to a place where James Walker can be taken easily. Sarah felt her heart clench as she realized the enormous risk Grey Wolf was taking. If Morrison suspected deception, if any of his men recognized Grey Wolf as Running Bear's son, rather than a genuine defector, the young warrior would be tortured to death in ways that would make his father's worst nightmares seem merciful. What if Morrison does not believe him? Sarah asked. What if Crow Dog recognizes Grey Wolf and exposes the deception? Then Grey Wolf dies as an Apache warrior, should protecting his people from their enemies. Running Bear replied with the stoic acceptance of a man who had sent many friends to their deaths over the years. But if he succeeds, if he can convince even half of Morrison's men to abandon their employer, the odds of victory improve dramatically. James caught Sarah's arm as the warriors began moving toward their horses, his expression urgent. There is something I need to tell you before this begins, something you need to know in case you die, Sarah finished, her voice steady despite the tears she was fighting. I already know everything I need to know about you, James Walker. You are a good man who chose justice over safety, who loves me enough to risk his life for my people's freedom. That is enough. But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew there was something she had not told him. Something he deserved to know before he rode into battle. The secret of their child pressed against her heart like a stone, demanding to be shared despite the danger such knowledge might create. James, she began, then stopped as she saw the look in his eyes, the expression of a man preparing for death. This was not the time for revelations that might shake his resolve or distract him from the deadly work ahead. Come back to me, she said instead, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. Whatever happens, whatever you have to do to survive, come back to me. James held her close for a moment that felt like eternity, both of them memorizing the feel of each other's bodies, the sound of each other's breathing, the warmth that passed between them without words. Then he was mounting his horse and following the Apache warriors into the darkness, leaving Sarah alone with her fears and the growing certainty that her life was about to change in ways she could not imagine. The battle at Devil's Gateway began before dawn with the kind of confusion that turned organized warfare into deadly chaos. Grey Wolf's mission had been partially successful. He had managed to convince 6 of Morrison's hired guns that continuing the hunt meant certain death at the hands of Apache warriors who knew the terrain better than they knew their own names. Those men had slipped away in the darkness, taking their weapons and horses, but leaving Morrison with a force depleted by nearly a quarter. But Crow Dog had indeed recognized Grey Wolf, had exposed the deception, just as the young Apache warrior was preparing to guide Morrison's remaining men into the Box Canyon trap. The traitor's warning had saved Morrison from walking blindly into the killing ground, but it had also cost Grey Wolf his life in a manner that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. James heard the news from a scout who had witnessed the torture and execution from concealment among the rocks. Morrison had taken his time with Grey Wolf, using methods learned from Apache prisoners to extract information about the trap that awaited his force. The young warrior had died without revealing anything beyond what Morrison already suspected, but his sacrifice had given the enemy enough warning to change their tactical approach. Instead of entering Devil's Gateway as planned, Morrison had positioned his remaining 24 men in defensive positions around the canyon mouth, turning the Apache trap into a siege that favored the side with superior firepower and supplies. Running Bear's warriors found themselves pinned in the Box Canyon they had intended as a killing ground for their enemies, with no way to retreat and limited ability to attack without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. The siege stretched through the morning and into the afternoon, with occasional exchanges of gunfire that accomplished little beyond wasting ammunition both sides could not afford to lose. Sarah waited at the Apache camp with the other women, tending wounded scouts and listening for news that might tell her whether the men she loved were still alive. The first casualty reports were devastating. 2 Apache warriors dead, 3 wounded, seriously enough to be withdrawn from the fight. Morrison's force had also taken losses, but they could afford attrition better than the Apache could. Time was on the white man's side, and everyone knew it. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that she knew her grandfather would condemn as foolish, but that seemed like the only hope of ending the slaughter before it consumed everyone she cared about. She would ride to Devil's Gateway herself, would attempt to negotiate a solution that might save Apache lives, even if it cost her everything she had built in both worlds. The ride through the desert took her past landmarks that had defined her entire life. The spring where her grandmother had taught her to gather medicinal plants, the mesa where she had experienced her first vision, Quest, the trading post where she had learned to speak English from a patient missionary who believed Apache souls were worth saving. Each familiar sight reminded her of the life she was leaving behind, the identity she was abandoning for the sake of love and the hope of peace. Devil's Gateway looked different in the dying light of evening, less like a natural fortress and more like a tomb carved from red stone. She could see Morrison's men positioned among the rocks at the canyon mouth, their rifles glinting in the last rays of sunlight. Somewhere beyond them, in the narrow confines of the Box Canyon, James and her grandfather's warriors waited for darkness or death, whichever came first. Sarah dismounted a quarter-mile from the siege lines and walked forward with her hands raised, calling out in English for a parley. She had gambled that Morrison's hatred of James Walker was stronger than his desire to kill random Apache, that he would see her as a potential source of information rather than just another enemy to be eliminated. The gamble paid off. Morrison himself emerged from cover to meet her, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive clothes torn by hours of fighting in rocky terrain. But his pale eyes still held the cold intelligence that had made him one of the most feared men in the territory, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver. "Miss Crow Feather," he said with mock courtesy, "how thoughtful of you to join our little gathering. I trust you have something useful to tell me about James Walker's location." "I have a proposal," Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. "Something that might end this siege without more bloodshed on either side." Morrison smiled with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed victory was within his grasp. "I am listening, but I should warn you that my patience for Apache lies has been exhausted by recent events." Sarah took a deep breath and spoke the words that would either save the men she loved or doom them all to death in this desolate canyon. "I will give you James Walker in exchange for safe passage for the Apache warriors trapped in Devil's Gateway." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden traps. "You know where Walker is?" "I know where he will be," Sarah replied. "Tonight when darkness falls and your men are focused on the canyon mouth. I know how to call him out of hiding, how to deliver him to you alive and ready for hanging." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing the value of James Walker's capture against the satisfaction of massacring the Apache warriors who had killed several of his men. "What makes you think I would trust you? What makes you think I won't simply take your information and kill the Apache anyway?" "Because you are a businessman as well as a killer," Sarah said, gambling everything on her assessment of Morrison's character. "Those warriors in the canyon represent potential witnesses to what happened here. Men who could testify about your methods if this incident ever reaches a territorial court. Dead witnesses cannot speak, but neither can they be tortured into confessions that might implicate you in the murder of Apache families." She paused, letting the implications of her words sink in. "But if you let them go, if you allow them to return to their families with stories of your mercy and justice, they become proof that you are a reasonable man driven to extreme measures by Apache lawlessness. That kind of reputation might be useful when territorial investigators start asking questions about recent events." Morrison's smile grew wider and somehow more threatening. "You are more clever than I gave you credit for, Miss Crow Feather. Very well, bring me James Walker alive, and I will allow your grandfather's warriors to leave Devil's Gateway unharmed. But if this is some Apache trick, if Walker does not appear as promised, I will personally ensure that you watch every one of those warriors die slowly." Sarah nodded, sealing a bargain that felt like signing her own death warrant. "How will you know I am not leading you into an ambush?" "Because you will be with me when Walker appears," Morrison replied. "You will stand beside me when I place the noose around his neck, will watch his face as he realizes that his Apache lover betrayed him for the promise of mercy she will never receive." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself to show no reaction beyond polite acknowledgement. Morrison had revealed more than he intended, had confirmed that he knew about her relationship with James and planned to use that knowledge as psychological torture for both of them. "When do you want him delivered?" Sarah asked. "Midnight," Morrison replied, "at the old Apache burial ground 2 miles north of here. Tell Walker that you have information about a new escape route, something that will get him safely to Mexico. He will come because he trusts you, because he believes you would never betray him." Sarah felt sick as she realized how perfectly Morrison had read the situation, how completely he understood the bonds of trust and love that could be turned into weapons against those who dared to feel them. And if he suspects a trap, then you convince him otherwise, Morrison said with casual cruelty. You are, after all, the woman he loves, the woman carrying his child. The revelation hit Sarah like a thunderbolt, stealing her breath and making her legs weak. Morrison knew about the pregnancy, had somehow learned about the most intimate secret of her life. The knowledge gave him leverage she had not expected, a way to ensure her cooperation through threats against the unborn child she carried. How did you? Sarah began, then stopped as she realized the futility of the question. Morrison had resources throughout the territory, informants and spies who reported everything of interest to their wealthy patron. Someone at Fort Apache or in the Apache community had noticed the subtle signs of her condition and sold that information for Morrison's gold. Does Walker know? Morrison asked with the casual interest of a man discussing the weather. Does he know that his moment of passion has created new life, or have you kept that secret to yourself? Sarah's silence was answer enough. Morrison's smile grew even more predatory as he realized the psychological weapon he now possessed. How deliciously tragic, he murmured. The great hero James Walker, dying without ever knowing he was about to become a father. Unless, of course, you choose to tell him during your final moments together. I suppose that would depend on whether you want his last thoughts to be of love or betrayal. Sarah forced herself to meet Morrison's pale eyes despite the revulsion that threatened to overwhelm her. I will bring him to you, but I want your word that the Apache warriors will be allowed to leave unharmed. You have it, Morrison replied with mock solemnity. The word of a gentleman, which is worth exactly as much as the word of an Apache half-breed whore who sells her lover for the promise of mercy. Sarah turned and walked back toward her horse, without another word, knowing that any response would only give Morrison more ammunition for his psychological warfare. She had made her choice, had traded James's life for the lives of 20 Apache warriors, and the slim hope that her unborn child might somehow survive the catastrophe she had set in motion. The ride back to the Apache camp was the longest of her life, every step of her horse carrying her closer to a betrayal that would haunt her for whatever time remained to her. She had perhaps 6 hours before the midnight meeting. Morrison had demanded 6 hours to somehow convince James to walk into a trap that would mean his certain death. But as Sarah rode through the desert darkness, a different plan began forming in her mind, a desperate gamble that might turn Morrison's trap against him and save not only James but the Apache warriors trapped in Devil's Gateway. It would require perfect timing and absolute trust from people who had every reason to doubt her, but it was their only hope of survival. The key was Morrison's arrogance, his absolute certainty that Sarah would betray James rather than risk her own life and the life of her unborn child. That arrogance was also his weakness, the blind spot that might allow her to turn his carefully laid trap into his own destruction. Sarah found Running Bear's camp in chaos as warriors prepared for what they believed would be their final assault on Morrison's positions. Her grandfather looked up as she dismounted, his weathered face showing the strain of sending his best fighters into battle against impossible odds. Granddaughter, he said quietly, you should not have come here. The fighting will resume at dawn, and Morrison's men will show no mercy to Apache women caught in their path. The fighting will not resume, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a certainty that made every warrior in the camp stop what they were doing to listen. I have made an arrangement with Morrison, a trade that will end this siege without more Apache deaths. Running Bear's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, reading there the kind of grim determination he had seen in warriors preparing for suicide missions. What kind of arrangement? Sarah told them everything: Morrison's demand for James Walker's capture, the midnight meeting at the burial ground, the threats against her unborn child that had forced her compliance. She watched her grandfather's face grow harder with each word, saw the accumulated disappointment and rage of a man whose granddaughter had been forced to choose between impossible alternatives. You would betray the man you love, Running Bear asked when she finished. I would appear to betray him, Sarah corrected. Morrison expects treachery from an Apache woman caught between loyalty and survival. He will be watching for armed warriors, for obvious traps, for anything that suggests an ambush. He will not be expecting the truth. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the intense whisper she had learned from her grandmother during the telling of sacred stories. What Morrison does not know is that James Walker is not just a man with a price on his head. He is a warrior who has been accepted by the Apache, who has earned the right to call upon Apache brotherhood when facing his enemies. Understanding dawned in Running Bear's eyes as he grasped the full implications of what Sarah was proposing. You want Apache warriors at the burial ground, hidden and waiting for the moment when Morrison reveals his true intentions. I want James to know that he is not walking into his execution alone, Sarah replied. I want Morrison to discover that betraying one Apache means facing the wrath of all Apache. And I want my child to know that his father died as a warrior among warriors, not as a victim of treachery and hate. The plan that emerged from their hurried council was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its reliance on split-second timing. 6 Apache warriors would position themselves around the burial ground, hidden among the ancient graves and weathered monuments, where generations of Apache dead watched over their descendants. When Morrison's trap was sprung, when he revealed his intention to kill both James and Sarah, the warriors would strike with the coordinated precision of a wolf pack taking down prey. But the success of the plan depended entirely on James's willingness to trust Sarah, despite every indication that she was leading him to his death. If he suspected betrayal, if he refused to come to the burial ground, Morrison would have no choice but to resume the siege that would eventually destroy every Apache warrior in Devil's Gateway. Sarah found James in a hidden camp 3 miles from the battle site where he had been waiting for news of the siege with the patience of a man accustomed to long hunts through dangerous territory. He looked up as she approached, his gray eyes lighting with relief and concern. Sarah, he said, rising to embrace her, I was beginning to think Morrison had captured you. What news from Devil's Gateway? Sarah allowed herself a moment of contact, drawing strength from the feel of his arms around her and the knowledge that this might be their last peaceful moment together. Then she pulled back and spoke the words that would either save or damn them both. I have found a way out, she said, hating the deception, but knowing it was necessary. A route that will take you safely to Mexico, away from Morrison's hunt and the Apache war that is consuming this territory. James studied her face with the attention of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. What kind of route? My grandmother told me of caves that run deep beneath the desert passages that were old when the first Apache came to this land. The entrance is at the burial ground north of Devil's Gateway, hidden among the graves where Morrison's men will not think to look. Sarah forced herself to meet his eyes as she spoke the lies that might save his life. If we can reach the caves by midnight, we can be 20 miles away by dawn, traveling underground through passages that emerge near the Mexican border. James was quiet for a long moment, his tactical mind evaluating the plan for flaws and alternatives. Why now? Why not wait until the siege is resolved one way or another? Because Morrison is preparing to bring up artillery, Sarah replied, adding truth to her web of deception. By tomorrow night, he will have cannons capable of collapsing the canyon mouth, sealing your warriors inside to starve or surrender. This may be our only chance. The lie was convincing because it was built on strategic truth. Morrison did have access to military equipment through his political connections, and artillery would indeed make the Apache position at Devil's Gateway untenable. James nodded slowly, accepting the logical necessity of immediate action. What about your grandfather's warriors? I will not abandon them to save my own skin. Sarah felt a stab of pain at his nobility, at the way he continued to put others' welfare ahead of his own survival, even when facing certain death. They will retreat through the desert on foot, scattering in small groups that can evade pursuit. Apache warriors know how to disappear when conventional tactics fail. James was still not entirely convinced, but the pressure of time and circumstances was forcing his decision. How do we reach the burial ground without being seen by Morrison's scouts? I know the paths, Sarah replied. Routes my people have used for generations to visit the graves of our ancestors without interference from white soldiers. We can be there by midnight if we leave now. James nodded, beginning to gather his few possessions with the efficiency of a man who had learned to travel light. Lead the way. The ride to the burial ground took them through country that held memories from every period of Sarah's life. She had come here as a child with her grandmother, learning the names of ancestors whose bones lay beneath the desert sand and whose spirits watched over their descendants. She had returned as a young woman, seeking visions that might guide her through the confusion of existing between two hostile worlds. Now she rode the familiar paths one last time, carrying with her the knowledge that whatever happened at midnight would fundamentally change everything she had ever been or hoped to become. Win or lose, live or die, she would never again be simply Sarah Crowfeather, interpreter, and bridge between cultures. She would be either a widow carrying the child of a murdered hero, or the woman who had helped love triumph over hatred through courage and careful planning. The burial ground appeared before them like a vision from Apache mythology, its ancient monuments and weathered grave markers casting strange shadows in the moonlight. This was sacred ground, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, where the spirits of Apache warriors were said to ride the wind and guide their descendants through times of great danger. Sarah dismounted at the edge of the cemetery, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Somewhere among the graves, Running Bear's warriors waited in concealment, their lives, and James's life depending on her ability to maintain the deception until Morrison revealed his true intentions. "Where is the cave entrance?" James asked, dismounting beside her and studying the terrain with professional interest. "There." Sarah pointed toward a cluster of larger monuments at the cemetery's center. "Hidden beneath the marker stone of my great-grandfather, who was war chief during the time of the Mexican Troubles." James nodded, accepting her explanation, despite what must have been growing doubts about the entire enterprise. Sarah realized that his trust was not based on the believability of her story, but on his faith in her character, his absolute certainty that she would never willingly lead him into danger. The knowledge made her betrayal feel even more devastating, even though she was betraying him in order to save him. Love, she was learning, created impossible moral puzzles that had no clean solutions, only choices between different kinds of pain. They had reached the center of the burial ground when Morrison's voice cut through the desert silence like a blade through silk. "How touching," he said, emerging from behind a monument with his gun drawn and pointed at James's chest. "The great hero James Walker led to slaughter by the woman he loves. It is almost poetic in its justice." James spun toward the voice, his hand dropping to his own weapon, but froze as he saw the rifle barrels emerging from concealment all around the burial ground. Morrison had brought at least a dozen men, far more than Sarah had expected, positioning them in a ring that made escape impossible. "Sarah," James said quietly, his voice carrying more sadness than anger, "please tell me this is not what it appears to be." "Oh, but it is exactly what it appears to be," Morrison said with savage satisfaction. "Your devoted Apache lover has sold you for the promise of mercy, just as I knew she would when properly motivated. The maternal instinct is remarkably predictable in its selfishness." Sarah saw James's face go white as Morrison's words sank in, saw him realize not only that she was carrying his child, but that she had betrayed him to protect that child's life. The pain in his eyes was worse than any physical wound she had ever tended. "James," she began, but Morrison cut her off with a gesture. "Save your explanations for the devil, Miss Crowfeather. You have served your purpose, and that purpose is now concluded." Morrison raised his gun towards Sarah, his intention clear, despite his earlier promises of mercy. But before he could fire, the burial ground erupted in violence as Running Bear's hidden warriors launched their coordinated attack. The battle was brief but savage, fought among the graves of Apache ancestors whose spirits seemed to guide their descendants' weapons with supernatural accuracy. Morrison's men, caught off guard by the sudden assault from multiple directions, fell quickly to arrows and rifle fire delivered with the precision of hunters who had learned their craft, stalking prey far more dangerous than hired gunmen. James threw himself towards Sarah as the shooting began, shielding her body with his own while drawing his gun to add his firepower to the Apache assault. Together they crouched behind a stone monument while bullets chipped fragments from the weathered granite and war cries echoed across the sacred ground. Morrison himself proved harder to kill than his hired men, fighting with the desperate courage of a man who knew surrender meant torture and death at Apache hands. He had taken cover behind the largest monument and was laying down accurate fire that kept the Apache warriors from closing distance for a killing shot. "Sarah," James said during a brief lull in the firing, "I need to know, did you really betray me, or was this all part of some plan I was not told about?" Sarah met his eyes in the moonlight, seeing there the need for truth that transcended their desperate tactical situation. "I made a bargain with Morrison to save Running Bear's warriors trapped in Devil's Gateway, but I never intended for you to die. The Apache were hidden here before we arrived, waiting to turn Morrison's trap against him." James nodded understanding and forgiveness, replacing the pain that had marked his features since Morrison's revelation. "The child is mine." "Yes. Then we had better survive this, so I can meet him properly." James rose from cover and began moving toward Morrison's position with the fluid grace of a predator closing on wounded prey. Sarah watched him advance through the gravy ones, using each monument as cover, while Apache warriors provided supporting fire from the flanks. The final confrontation came at the base of the cemetery's central monument, where Morrison had made his last stand among the graves of Apache war chiefs. He and James faced each other across 20 feet of open ground, both men wounded, both down to their last few rounds of ammunition. "You should have stayed dead, Walker." Morrison snarled, his expensive clothes torn and bloody, his silver hair matted with sweat and dust. "Should have let my boy's death be the end of it. Your boy chose his fate when he decided rape and murder were acceptable ways to get what he wanted." James replied, his voice steady despite the bullet wound in his left arm. "I just made sure he paid the price." "And what price will you pay?" Morrison demanded. "What will happen to that half-breed whore and her bastard child when I put a bullet through your heart?" "That," said Running Bear's voice from the shadows, "is not your decision to make." The Apache chief emerged from concealment behind Morrison, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. Before Morrison could turn, before he could bring his gun to bear on this new threat, Running Bear struck with the swift precision of a serpent taking prey. Morrison's scream echoed across the burial ground, then faded into the silence of death. The man who had terrorized Apache families, who had murdered innocents in pursuit of personal vengeance, lay still among the graves of warriors whose courage he had never understood. "It is finished," Running Bear announced, his voice carrying across the cemetery to where Apache warriors were checking the bodies of Morrison's men. "The threat to our people is ended." Sarah rose from behind the monument where she had taken shelter, her legs weak with relief and exhaustion. The battle was over, but she knew the consequences would reverberate throughout the territory for months or years to come. Morrison's death would create a power vacuum that others would rush to fill, would change the political landscape in ways that could not be predicted. James holstered his gun and walked toward her, his face showing the kind of weariness that came from surviving violence that should have killed him. When he reached her, he pulled her into his arms and held her close, both of them trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands moving over her body to check for wounds. "No," Sarah replied, allowing herself to lean against his strength. "But James, we need to talk about what happens now. Morrison is dead, but his allies in the territorial government will demand answers. They will investigate his disappearance, will look for someone to blame." Running Bear approached them, wiping Morrison's blood from his knife with methodical precision. "There will be no investigation," he said with quiet certainty. Morrison came into Apache territory with hired killers seeking to murder innocent people in pursuit of personal revenge. He found the justice he deserved. "The army will not see it that way," Sarah protested. "They will demand explanations, will threaten military action if Apache involvement cannot be denied." "Let them threaten," Running Bear replied. "Colonel Henderson is an honorable man who understands that some problems solve themselves. He will not order his soldiers to avenge a man whose crimes were becoming an embarrassment to the territorial government." Sarah wanted to believe her grandfather's confidence, but she had seen how quickly political winds could change when powerful interests were threatened. Morrison might be dead, but his allies remained, and they would not easily accept the loss of their champion. "What about us?" James asked, indicating himself and Sarah. "Where do we go from here?" Running Bear studied the couple with eyes that held both approval and sadness. "That depends on what you choose to build together. James Walker is still wanted for murder in the white man's courts, but John Coleman is free to live wherever he can find acceptance." Sarah understood what her grandfather was offering. New identities, clean starts, the chance to disappear into the vast expanse of the American frontier, where questions were rarely asked and past mistakes could be buried beneath new achievements. "And if we choose to stay," Sarah asked, "if we want to remain connected to the Apache people in this land, then you will be welcome," Running Bear replied. "James has proven himself a warrior worthy of Apache brotherhood. Your child will grow up knowing both sides of his heritage, understanding that strength comes from bridging differences rather than choosing sides." James squeezed Sarah's hand gently. "What do you want to do?" Sarah looked around the burial ground, seeing in the ancient monuments and weathered graves a continuity that transcended the violence and hatred that had brought them to this place. This was where her ancestors lay, where her grandmother's spirit dwelt, where the roots of her identity ran deeper than politics or racial prejudice. "I want to stay," she said finally. I want our child to know where he comes from, to understand that he is part of something larger than the circumstances of his conception. I want him to know that his parents chose love over safety, chose to build something new, rather than run from something difficult. James nodded, his decision made. Then we stay. We find a place where John Coleman and Mary Coleman can raise horses and children, where they can serve as bridges between communities that need to learn to live in peace. Running Bear smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose plans had achieved their intended results. There is land in the mountains where clear water runs year-round, and the grass grows thick enough to support cattle and horses. It is far enough from settlements that questions are rarely asked, close enough to Apache camps that you will have friends when you need them. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah and James prepared to begin their new life together. The burial ground where they had faced death and found love looked different in the morning light, less like a place of ancient sorrow and more like the foundation for future hope. They would bury the identities that had brought them together and create new ones that would allow them to build something lasting. Sarah Crowfeather would become Mary Coleman, a rancher's wife, whose mixed heritage made her valuable as a negotiator between Apache bands and white settlers. James Walker would become John Coleman, a man whose mysterious past was less important than his obvious skill with horses and his respect for all people regardless of color or culture. It would not be an easy life. The frontier offered no guarantees of safety or prosperity, no protection from the prejudices that might follow them wherever they went. But it would be their life built on the foundation of choices they had made together, defended by allies who understood the value of courage over convenience. 5 years later, Mary Coleman stood in the doorway of their ranch house, watching her husband John teaching their young son to ride. The boy had his father's gray eyes, but his mother's Apache grace, a bridge between worlds that his parents had fought so hard to protect. In the distance, Running Bear approached on his aging pony, coming for his monthly visit to see his great-grandson. The old chief had lived to see his granddaughter find happiness, had watched their ranch become a place where Apache and white settlers could meet as equals. The wanted posters for James Walker had long since faded from courthouse walls, replaced by newer threats and more pressing concerns. John Coleman was known throughout the territory as a fair dealer and trusted mediator, a man whose word was his bond and whose ranch was neutral ground where disputes could be settled without violence. Their second child, a daughter with Sarah's green eyes and James's stubborn chin, played in the yard with Apache and Mexican children whose parents had found work and safety at the Coleman Ranch. It was not the world either Sarah or James had been born into, but it was the world they had chosen to create, a place where love mattered more than bloodline and character counted for more than the circumstances of one's birth. Sarah had finally found what she had searched for all her life, not a place between two worlds, but a new world built on the foundation of love, courage, and the belief that some things were worth any price. She was no longer caught between cultures, but had become the creator of a culture that honored the best of all traditions while rejecting the worst of ancient prejudices. As evening fell and the family gathered for dinner, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. It had begun with a chance encounter in a sacred canyon, had survived betrayal, and warfare had been tested by forces that sought to destroy everything they valued. But love, she had learned, was stronger than hatred when it was backed by courage and defended by people willing to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. The Apache way had taught her that survival sometimes required making choices that seemed impossible, that victory could emerge from apparent defeat when the stakes were high enough and the will was strong enough. James reached for her hand across the dinner table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Their children chattered about their day's adventures, while Running Bear told stories of the old times when Apache warriors rode free across lands that stretched to every horizon. It was Sarah realized exactly the life her grandmother had envisioned during those long winter evenings, when stories were the only warmth and hope was the only currency that mattered. She had become the bridge between worlds her grandmother had prophesied, not by choosing one side over another, but by creating a third option that honored all the traditions that had shaped her. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over their first meeting and would continue to watch over the life they were building together. In their light, Sarah saw not just the end of one story, but the beginning of countless others' tales that would be told by children and grandchildren who would inherit a world where love had proven stronger than hate, where courage had triumphed over fear, where the choice to build rather than destroy had created something beautiful from the ashes of old conflicts. She squeezed James's hand and smiled at her family gathered around their table, knowing that this was how legends began, not with grand gestures or famous names, but with ordinary people making extraordinary choices, with love that refused to be defeated by the forces arrayed against it, with the simple decision to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, if enough people were willing to work for that better world. The Apache's heart, she had learned, was not just about surviving between cultures, but about creating new cultures that honored the best of the past while building hope for the future. And in that truth, she found the peace that had eluded her throughout her young life, the certainty that some stories were worth telling, some loves were worth fighting for,